Welcome, everybody. A nation of trees, drab green and desolate grey in the field uniform of modern wars, darkens her hills, those endless outstretched paws of sphinx demolished or stone lion worn away. They call her a young country, but they lie. She is the last of lands, the emptiest, a woman beyond the change of life, a breast still tender, but within the womb is dry. Without songs, architecture, history, the emotions and superstitions of younger lands, her rivers of water drown among inland sands. The river of her immense stupidity floods her monotonous tribes from Cairns to Perth. In them at last the ultimate men arrive, whose boast is not, we live, but we survive, a type who will inhabit the dying earth. And her 5 cities, like 5 teeming sores, each drains her, a vast parasite, robber state, where second-hand Europeans pullulate timidly on edge of alien shores. Imagine the serpent's breathing rhythms as the tide flows inland, edging towards the spring waters, nestled deeply in the gorges of the ancient limestone plateau covered with rattling grasses, yellow from the prevailing winds. Then from the outward breath, the tide turns and the serpent flows back to its own circulating mass of shallow waters in the giant water basin in a crook of the mainland whose sides separate from the open sea. I looked out my window in the dark, at waves with diamond quills and combs of light that arched their mackerel backs and smacked the sand in the moon's drench, that straight, enormous glaze. And ships far off asleep, and harbour boys tossing their fireballs wearily each to each, and tried to hear your voice. But all I heard was a boat's whistle, and the scraping squeal of seabirds' voices far away, and bells. 5 bells. 5 bells coldly ringing out. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Ian Henderson, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome you to the Menzies Centre for Australian Studies panel discussion, part of the 2014 Arts and Humanities Festival, the theme of which is Underground. It's a theme very friendly to the land down under. Ground, land, country pervade Australian literature, of which I've just given you the tiniest scraping of a sample, just to signal my own field of research. We've had, from the grand old man of Australian letters, A.D. Hope, a matchless evocation of banal settler land and culture, its cities an ecological disaster waiting to happen, but in the heart of whose deserts, nonetheless, he will go on to find some kind of prophetic inspiration. From Alexis Wright, a one-year woman from the Gulf of Carpentaria, a landscape through which the ancestors continue to move, making life and meaning of the whole world in the land, but also in the hand of its Aboriginal writers. And finally, from our great modernist poet, Kenneth Slessor, the poem which is our In Memoriam, an elegy to his mate, Joe Lynch, who one night fell off a Sydney harbour ferry and was drowned. Slessor wonders whether reflections in glass, water and poetry only ever throw back our own and never the true voices of the dead. New memories swirl in Australian seawater, hinting, though with no sense of certainty, a new possibility for settler belonging, undoubted in other writers, such as Dorothy McKellar. I love a sunburned country, a land of sweeping plains, of rugged mountain ranges, of droughts and flooding rains. They're lines that were first drafted in London and first published in The Spectator in 1908. We have 3 very distinguished speakers, about whom more in a moment, each of whom will take a very different take on tonight's subject, exploring the entanglement of concepts of land, country and nation in that place we call Australia from the perspective of their own research, and dwelling perhaps also on how these impact the way we research and teach in a field called Australian Studies. So might we all consider such matters in discussion after each of our special guests has spoken, each for about 15 minutes. The future of Australian studies is a topic that a yet larger group of experts from Britain, Australia, Europe and the United States will debate tomorrow. And a special welcome to our delegates to that symposium, which promises to be an exciting day. Both tonight and tomorrow form part of a celebration of the Menzies Centre's past, present and future. This year we are marking the 15th year of our embedding in King's College London and the 32nd year since we were established as an Australian Studies Centre at the University of London's Institute of Commonwealth Studies. We were officially opened on the 9th of June 1983 by none other than Bob Hawke and in the presence of the Queen Mother. In his speech, Hawke drew attention to what he called the recognition of Australians that they belong forever to the Southeast Asian region. Well, I wonder. Let me introduce our speakers. Our first speaker is Anne Collette, a distinguished visiting chair who's holding the distinguished visiting chair in Australian Studies at the University of Copenhagen. She is also the Associate Professor in the School of Arts, English and Media at the University of Wollongong, and she'll be speaking tonight on Connecting Australia, Japan and Denmark, the common ground of environmental activism. Dr. Gay Sculthorpe is Curator and Section Head of Oceania in the Department of Africa, Oceania and the Americas at the British Museum. She'll be talking about negotiating competing conceptions of country in Australia, specifically while developing the British Museum's upcoming exhibition of its Australian collection. John Tominey is Professor of Urban and Regional Planning in the Bartlett School of Planning, University College London. Up there, that nasty place up on Gower Street. Adjunct Professor in the department. He's also Adjunct Professor in the Department of Geography and Environmental Sciences at Monash University. We're particularly grateful that John has come down the street to speak to us. Yeah, and he's a visiting professorial fellow at the University of New South Wales, Sydney. He'll be speaking on Australia, an urban nation, exploring the political, economic and cultural geographies that shape life in what might be the most urban nation on Earth. So we'll run each of the papers together and then we'll open up the floor for general discussion. So please join me in welcoming all our speakers, but in particular our first speaker, Anne Collette. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here, and I would like to thank Ian first for the invitation. And it's wonderful to see, in fact, so many familiar faces. Okay, I have to decide which glasses to wear at this point. I think the bifocals, that way I get to see what I've written, but I can't see too much of you. Okay, so as you can see, I have two images up here. The first relates to the Great East Japan earthquake, tsunami and nuclear disaster of March 2011. And the second relates to Black Saturday, the bushfires that raged through northeast of Melbourne, Australia in February 2009. And I'm going to talk to you about the relationship between these two things. I'm going to return to Australia a bit later in my talk, but I want to begin with Australian studies and an Australian, that being myself, in Japan, 5 months after the catastrophic earthquake, tsunami and nuclear disaster of what became known as 3/11. It may seem a little odd in an event devoted to a discussion of the role and importance of Australian studies in the world that I should choose to spend the first half of my talk on Japan. But the point I want to make is that the work of Australian Studies Centres, the appointment of visiting scholars to international universities, and the teaching of and research into things Australian in the world, beyond Australia's borders, is that what is learnt about the many worlds in which Australian studies is thereby situated, and what we learn also about ourselves as Australians and Australian society, is as important as the dissemination of things Australian. It's actually about being on the ground in these different places. The view thereby of Australia shifts, the perspective we take on Australia changes, importantly in relation to. It's the connections we make that are important. This is where the vitality of Australian studies lies. So let me start then with Japan. I received the good news of my appointment as a visiting professor to the University of Tokyo a day before the earthquake and the devastating tsunami hit the east coast of Japan, not very far from Tokyo. I can still recall the shock of watching the black surge of water that engulfed all in its path, boats, buildings and people. And then the terrible news of the damage to the nuclear plants. I didn't, however, consider not going. This was perhaps foolishness, but I figured that my visit was still some time away, and anyway, Tokyo wasn't Fukushima. I may live to regret that decision, I certainly hope not, but my year in Japan was very enjoyable and enormously rewarding, perhaps particularly because I was on the ground soon after the disaster when shockwaves continued to rock the country, literally, politically and psychologically. So let me move to my second image. So here, I just want to begin by talking about connection, connecting and connecting. A year after the disastrous events of 3/11, and during the period of my stint as visiting professor at the University of Tokyo, Peter Fitzgerald, whom I'm sure a number of you will be familiar with, reported a story in his Sydney Morning Herald Saturday sports column. It was gleaned from the Anchorage Daily News, and the story tells of, quote, a bloke by the name of David Baxter, who was walking on the beach of a remote Alaskan island when he spotted a very battered soccer ball with Japanese writing on it. He took the ball home so his Japanese wife, Yumi, could tell him what it said. She identified it as having originated from a Japanese school that had been engulfed by the tsunami. The Japan Times got involved in a hunt to discover the owner of the ball and found that it belonged to 16-year-old high school student Misaki Murakami, who revealed that the ball had been given to him by his third grade classmates before he moved to a new school in March 2005. One of the messages on the ball reads, "Hang in there, Murakami," an affectingly apt extortion for a boy who came to lose so much more than his soccer ball. Misaki had lost his home, one of 3,000 homes destroyed in the city of Ritsutenka, and had searched the debris for anything belonging to his family, but he had found nothing. Reflecting on the loss and return of the ball, Misaki said, "My family lost everything to the tsunami, so I'm happy, but it also brings back sad memories. The soccer ball means a lot to me." This story of loss and recovery, a story of human and environmental connection, was reported in media across the world. Now, the point I would make here is not only of the indisputable connectedness of people and places, of geographies and histories, as evidenced by the soccer ball arriving on the shores of Alaska. And of course, this is an involuntary and sometimes undesirable connectedness, given the ocean traverse not only of soccer balls, but of cesium-affected tuna, for example. I also want to bring to your attention the deliberate nature of connection and its positive result, as seen in the effort made by David and Yumi Baxter to find the owner of the ball and to return it. It's not the return of the ball that is important, so much as the human desire to make connection, often across divides of geography, history and culture. Teaching Australian studies internationally is as much about making connections and about Australians discovering the world beyond their borders of knowledge and the limits of cultural perspective, as it is about enabling others to see and better understand Australia. So let me move to this image. Australian emergency response to the Toku disaster was immediate and it was generous. But this isn't the topic of my talk. I want rather to talk about two photographic exhibitions, one shown in Wollongong, Australia, my place of permanent residence, and the other in Tokyo, Japan, my place of temporary residence. The photographic exhibition shown in Sydney and Wollongong, organised at the behest of the Consulate General of Japan, took the form of sets of image series that showed the ruins of the disaster, the work towards recovery, and the triumphant survivors, who'd battled and overcome adversity with the help of others. The blurb on the advertising poster for Wollongong read, "In the aftermath of the tragedy across Japan, a spirit of Gambaro Toku, or let's pull together for Toku, emerged. The spirit remains strong, as those in the affected areas continue to rebuild their lives." The images in the Toku exhibition focus on the positive and show how far the people affected by earthquake and tsunami have come since the tragedy of March 2011. So I'll just show you what a typical triptych looked like. And just note the photograph that's being held. That's the first, that's the second, that's the third. Now I want to move on to show you a very different photographic exhibition, an exhibition that grew out of something called the Memory Salvage Project, of which photographer Tomoki Matsumoto commented, Many photographers took many photos of debris and other things in the tsunami-ravaged areas, but our photos show another side of the truth about disaster. And here's an example. These photographs are not photographic images of the disaster, but photographs affected by the disaster. And yet, in a strange way, they are in fact photos of the disaster. As rescue teams sorted through the debris of people's lives, a decision was made by those involved in the cleanup operations to collect the personal photographs found, however damaged, in an attempt to recover that which was lost, and if possible, to return the image of loved ones to those who had survived. The poster on sale at the exhibition, proceeds from which sale went towards assisting people in temporary housing, explained that they were not asked to do it, nor did they have a clear sense of objective. Perhaps they were just desperate to find something in the rubble that could be saved. 2 months after the earthquake, a group calling itself the Memory Salvage Project was formed to sort, clean, digitise and assist with identification and return of the photos to their owners. And here are just a few images of that process. Photographer Munimasa Takahashi, assisted by a team of more than 500 volunteers, offered to head the operation in the city of Yamamoto. Of the 30,000 photos recovered, 1,500 of those that remained unspoken for were selected by Takahashi for the exhibition Lost and Found. Now, 19,000 were returned before the exhibition was mounted, so it was actually quite a successful venture. The exhibition was advertised in the Japan Times, of which I was an avid reader at the time because I spoke no Japanese and it was written in English, so I found a lot about Japan through that. I managed to find my way to a small suburban house where the photographs were being displayed, and they looked like this. It was enormously affecting, far more so than any of the more usual disaster photos that tend to invite a kind of spurious disaster tourism. These photos brought home to me the extent of the disaster, the depth of loss, and the urgent need for political attention to be paid to an environmental catastrophe in which we had a part. Of course, Japan has long been affected by earthquake and tsunami, but the impact of the associated nuclear disaster was something from which full recovery will quite possibly never be made, for the ramifications were and are long-term. Given an energy-hungry world and the increased risks attached to climate change, increased force and frequency of typhoons, for example, the situation of nuclear plants in vulnerable coastal areas needs to be addressed. But this is not the focus of my talk this evening. First, I want to stress the degree to which the recovery, restitution, return, and exhibition of these photographs was a grassroots project, something felt and acted upon by those involved in the cleanup operation and those who volunteered to participate in the recovery of the project. It was not a top-down project, but rather came of the people, by the people, for the people. Secondly, I want to think about the power of the visual to stimulate response. It is both affective and effective for those intimately involved in production and those intimately involved in looking. The unnamed author of the poster text comments, "What are we supposed to feel and think when we look at these pictures? Should we be happy that they were found at all, or sad that they will never be returned to their owners? Or should we simply mourn for the dead? The more I struggle to find answers, the more missing pieces I seem to find. But without looking at these pictures, I don't think we'll see anything at all. Why not? What is it about the photographs that allows us to see something? And what is it that we see?" So I'm going to leave you to ponder that question, and perhaps we'll talk about this in discussion later. But now I want to move to Australia via Denmark at this point, and Sarah's painting of Black Saturday. In my role as visiting Professor of Australian Studies at the University of Copenhagen, I recently held a small symposium on cultural responses to environmental disaster in Australia. And the advertising blurb that I wrote read, "Australia is synonymous with fire and flood. There is nothing new about large-scale, big-impact natural disasters. Fire, flood, heat wave, deep freeze, hurricane, earthquake, tsunami, deforestation and desertification, to name a few, figure prominently in the natural and cultural record of human life on Earth. But a change in frequency and amplitude of occurrence, a change in the pattern of such, is increasingly evident in Australia and across the globe. The effects of environmental disaster are economically and politically significant. The impact on the lives of communities and individuals is often devastating, as it is on plant and animal life. The consequences are both short and long term. Local occurrence has global ramification. The symposium presented a range of cultural responses to environmental disaster in Australia and considered both the ways these responses have shaped our understanding of and attitude towards those often cataclysmic events, and the ways by which we might participate in the work towards averting, minimising, controlling, or more effectively responding to those events and their impacts. It was in my search for a poster image that I came across the archived collection of children's paintings sourced from the Museum of Victoria, and thereby I too assisted in the enlargement of audience for Sarah's artwork. In the first place, for hers was the image I chose for the poster because it was so beautiful and had the additional benefit of speaking directly to and with two of the papers delivered on the fires of Black Saturday. And in the second place, I also assisted in the greater audience for the view of the work of her fellow students, about which I spoke in my introduction to the symposium in Denmark. So now I'll move on to the other image with which I began the talk. This is Emily's representation of what she saw and felt about the fires that ravaged an area northeast of Melbourne in February 2009. At the time, Emily was a grade 6 student at Healesville Primary School. The town of Healesville became one of the main centres for the emergency response during the period of the fire's destructive progress and the clean-up operation after. On Black Saturday and in the days after it, Healesville was threatened by the Kilmore-Murrindindi complex fires, and for 3 weeks after Black Saturday, the primary school was exposed to extreme weather conditions and threat of fire. Some students and their families were evacuated on a number of occasions, and the school was closed for 4 days through February and March. When it was open, students came to school each morning to discover someone was missing from class, but unsure why, if they were safe, if they were hurt, if they or members of their families had died, been injured, or their homes been destroyed. A new art teacher had just arrived at the school and instituted an art program designed around the theme of natural disasters. Thus, unintentionally, but what might be seen to be fortuitous in less traumatic circumstances, laying the groundwork for the paintings that would be produced by these primary school students in the weeks that followed the Black Saturday fires. It seemed bizarrely serendipitous. These artworks might be understood to be a complex mix of response, reaction, interpretation, representation, hurt, anger, distress, grief, pride, puzzlement, healing. They are a terrifying kind of beauty. They are both terribly innocent and terribly knowledgeable. What is it that we see when we look at these paintings? What do we feel? How are we affected? And what do they ask of us? Some students wrote about their artwork and their feelings. Dylan, also a grade 6 student, wrote, "A wild bushfire has changed people's lives. I made the painting from seeing the glow of the fire in the distance. When the bushfires were over all, the trees were all black. You could hardly see the sun for the smoke." And a grade 3 student, Rory, wrote, "It is a disaster for us and for the whole of Victoria. The sun was an evil red and the leaves were burnt black. The dark clouds and burnt mountain is very, very sad." And Cassie's painting, Aftermath, speaks for itself. During 2009, the artworks were exhibited at the Zart Art Student Gallery at Box Hill and at the Yarra Valley Arts Council 14th Kids Art Exhibition. They were also displayed at the 56th Annual Lilydale Agricultural and Horticultural Show in November 2009, and a number were selected for a project entitled The Book of Light, an online project initiated by the Departments of Education and Early Childhood Education of Victoria. 39 of the artworks were put on display in the Melbourne Gallery at Melbourne Museum through the summer of December 2009 and January 2010. Why did the people of Victoria feel it was so important to exhibit the children's paintings? What meaning can we take from this effort not only to display them in numerous public places, but to preserve them online, both of which ensure the reach of as wide an audience as possible. Now, children's art is generally considered to be fairly ephemeral, a developmental phrase only of interest perhaps to child psychologists or fond parents or art scholars who value the juvenilia of great artists. There are any kind of reasons, but it's interesting to me that in the wake of an event of catastrophic dimension, and one not unlikely to be repeated, bushfires gaining in intensity and frequency of occurrence, the art of children is given prominence and seen to be significant. So my question to you is, why? So let's just move back to Emily's catastrophe. So I'll leave this for you to consider, but I would also point out that, like the Memory Salvage Project, this was a movement that was initiated and that gathered momentum through the combined efforts of the people. Government institutions had a part to play, but the enormous power of these paintings to make us see and make us feel is due in the first instance to the work of a teacher and her pupils. It's the work of people to maintain and strengthen community in the face of increasingly environmental catastrophe. But it's also an inclusive act that expands its borders to include all those in need of love. Reflecting on the fire and its effects on her family, friends, and community, Emily, the artist of catastrophe, wrote this. During this horrific time, everybody pulled together as one, as if we were all tied up in a big rubber band. Everyone talked to each other. Like if you were buying something, you would talk to the cashier and ask them questions such as, which town do you live in, and are you and your family safe, etc. And instead of saying goodbye or see you later, you'd say, stay safe. Which reminds me of the Japanese. Everyone pulled together as one. This was also the sentiment expressed by the survivors of the Tokyo earthquake. In the aftermath of the tragedy across Japan, a spirit of the Gambaro Tokyo, or let's pull together for Tokyo, emerged. Misaki's soccer ball is returned to him in the desire to make connection, the desire to connect, express sympathy, extend love. The effects of environmental disaster are economically and politically significant. The impact on the lives of communities and individuals is often devastating, as is the impact on plant and animal life. The consequences are both short and long term. Local occurrence has global ramification. But the common ground of grassroots activism is working to ensure we see more, we feel more, but will it also ensure that we act? Making the connections between us is the work of Australian studies in the world, and that may help to move us towards necessary action. And I say this in spite of the current attitude of our government that refuses to see, to think, to fund, or to act on climate change and its consequences that I believe are absolutely indisputable. No,
What does it mean to be an Australian or an Indigenous Australian in a global age? How do the transnational experiences of so many Australians, or of one Australian, me, alter the way we understand and write about nation and country? Are there differences in the way we think about Australian studies if we are out of Australia as opposed to when in Australia? How is Australia and Australian history conceived today by non-Australians, especially by the general public in the United Kingdom? Since March 2013, when I took up the position of Curator Oceania at the British Museum, I have been thinking about these questions in the context of the Australian collections at the British Museum and an exhibition about Indigenous Australia that will be presented at the museum in 2015, and I'm the curator for that exhibition. I'm going to speak briefly about the background and rationale for the exhibition and use some of the objects in the collections of the museum to address conflicting notions of country, both in Australia and between Australia and the United Kingdom. In thinking about the upcoming exhibition, And I have been actually very surprised about how much my thinking has changed since I arrived in London, and the benefits of thinking and writing and curating about Australia while myself being out of country. I've also had the privilege, since I've been here, of seeing firsthand some of the earliest Indigenous objects collected, which are in the British Museum, and showing them to the many Indigenous Australians who have visited London to see these collections, most of which are not on display. By way of background, in 2011, the British Museum, the Australian National University, and the National Museum of Australia began a 4-year research project entitled Engaging Objects, Indigenous Communities, Museum Collections, and the Representation of Indigenous Histories, based on the early collections from Australia in the British Museum. The research project is examining the ways in which Indigenous cultural materials entered the collections. By investigating these narratives, whether considered to be by way of trade, theft, loot, gifts, commissions, the project is opening the diversity of historical narratives and relationships that shape the collection. Part of the research involves taking images and information about those collections back to relevant communities in Australia and gaining new perspectives on them as well. In terms of the Australian Indigenous collections of the British Museum, it numbers approximately some 6,000 objects, ranging from 1770 until the present day. The objects represent some of the most extraordinary moments of early cultural contacts between British and Indigenous people. And unlike the majority of museum collections of Indigenous people held in Australia, they have a large emphasis on coastal contacts, particularly through naval voyages in the first half of the 19th century. Due to the time the objects were collected, there are actually very few objects from Central Australia, often considered the heart of Australia in the popular imagination. And as well, whereas most Australian museum collections have an emphasis on objects collected since about 1860, many of the objects in the British Museum collections were collected before 1860. And those objects that were collected in Australia before that date, many of them were in the Australian Museum in Sydney, which was established in 1827, but they were destroyed in a fire in 1882. So making the early collections here even more valuable because they're objects that you can't find in Australia. So since the beginning of the research project some years ago, it was envisaged that there would be 2 exhibitions, one in London and one in Australia. Initial thinking considered that it would likely be the same exhibition, but closer consideration of the approach suggested that the audiences and background and levels of information were quite distinct in London and in Canberra. Even casual conversations amongst my museum colleagues in London since I arrived revealed that what may be household names in Australia just draw a complete blank here. Albert Namatjira, Eddie Mabo, Major Mitchell, Birkin Wells, even James Cook. I was even asked, were there sheep in Australia before the British arrived? So it's quite surprising what people know about Australia and what they don't. The most perplexing reaction seems to be when I've used the word country and referring to the concept of country and its very special relationship for Indigenous people. It may well not be a concept that's particularly well grasped in Australia either. Therefore, in planning the London exhibition, it became clear that the notion of country should be a key idea that should be addressed in the exhibition. As with other exhibitions at the British Museum, we undertook some audience research here to gauge interest in the topic of Australia and Indigenous Australia and what would attract visitors to an exhibition about Australia. Some comments from the focus groups included. I don't want to go and pay to have people tell me how awful I was or how poorly my country treated others. If they tell me that they have brought the objects all up from Australia, that is one thing. If they told me they had brought them up from the basement, that is another. And from an Australian living in London, I personally feel that even though it's a shameful fact, that I personally didn't know about some of these things. I didn't encounter these stories very much. It is very interesting to me that it's very recent, this history, and I don't know about it. Or, I just go for the facts. I don't want a whole lot of guff. I want to know what I'm looking at and why I'm looking at it. By contrast, the views of Indigenous Australians gathered through the research project in Australia provided a variety of views about the objects and their being in the museum here. For example, really, it should have been left on country, where it's supposed to be. I guess there was a role for museums. I don't know what that role is now. Those things need to reconnect with where they came from. In terms of our mob having access and going to the exhibition, that's a start. I hope it will give them a jolt in regards to the true history of Australia. The most important thing is that these items are not just important to Aboriginal people, they're important to us as Australians. They're a part of our history. It links us together. So by summary, in terms of the background and the approach, one could say that many people here had an interest in the history of Australian Indigenous people, but limited background knowledge. Concepts such as dreaming and country are not well understood, but and although there are difficult histories to be told, visitors don't want to feel guilty about it. So therefore, with that background, how do we approach an exhibition about Indigenous Australia? So what I'm going to do now is just show you some of the objects and ideas that are contained with a short number of objects, and then I'll summarise at the end. And how many people in the audience are Australian? Not everyone, but quite a few. So you probably won't be surprised at the first slide. When I've shown this slide to my colleagues, people are just completely surprised. People say, yes, I know Australia was big, but I had no idea it was that big. Wow. Now this is a view from down under, and down under, down under. So if looking from Tasmania, where I'm from, and looking north. And one of the striking things about this image is how arid it is. And what Australians often take for granted, that our history for Indigenous Australians and modern Australians and everyone today, the location of water and of distance are still fundamental in terms of the way people live. And for Indigenous Australia, the very long history that can be read not in words but in pictures, in the huge variety of rock art that's found throughout the continent, including very recent images of ships, bicycles and other objects, as well as animals that you find. This is just one of the rock art images from Western Arnhem Land that's painted in a tradition going back at least, with this style of art, maybe 4,500 years. This is a bug painting in the collection of the museum that came from Western Arnhem Land in 1963, and people continue these traditions. So we're blessed with having the knowledge of contemporary Indigenous Australians who have a very, very deep knowledge of country. In the northwest Australia, on the right is images of the creation being known as the Wandjina, is found on rock art in the northwest and as an ancestral being for some groups in the Kimberley. On the left is a small painting on board that was done in 1939 in the Kimberley. That was at the transition of when rock art was being put onto new surfaces, and this one was on masonite, a very early one. The painting on the left is one done by Charlie Allengoy in 1970, and people still make images like this today. You might have seen some at the opening of the Olympic Games in Sydney in 2000. And on the right is just one particular object that I've been doing some research on. And it was described as a corroboree ornament, Western Australia. There was no other information about it. We knew from archival sources it came from 1926. We'd shown it to people from Northern Australia, experts in material culture. Oh, it's not from the Kimberleys, we don't know where it's from. But through the work of some of the scientists at the museum identifying all the plant materials in this, there are 5 or 6 different plant species contained in the manufacture of that ornament. Some are widely distributed. Northern Australia, Southern Australia, but there are 2 plant materials in there that only come from the Kimberleys. And so we believe this could be the only head ornament that represents the Wandjina spirit being. And just through the scientific work and the documentation, we're hoping to publish this and give this new light. And across the vast continent of Australia, on the left is a pearl shell, common northwest of Australia, with a fantastic decoration of men dancing with headdresses and ceremony and actually wearing pearl shells as pubic ornaments. And way across, thousands of miles across Australia, the pearl shell was traded and changed meaning. And to the right, another representation of the extensive system of ceremonial trade in Australia, which is a bag containing native tobacco or pitchery, and that was traded extensively throughout central Australia and Western Queensland. Now, who can recognise the figure on the right? It was interesting how many and who can and who can't. Now, on the left, some of you may have seen this object. It's on display in the Enlightenment Gallery at the museum. And through circumstantial evidence, but very strong circumstantial evidence, people believe it's the shield that James Cook picked up at Botany Bay when he landed there for a week in 1770. I've had as I said before, the privilege of showing people and Indigenous people some of these objects. And last year I showed some young Aboriginal women from Sydney this object. They didn't know it was here, they didn't know it was on display. They stood in front of the glass case and just cried for 10 minutes for everything that represents about Australian history. When Cook was at Botany Bay in 1770, he wrote about that and he said, all they seemed to want for us was to be gone. And a few days later he wrote, we could know but little of their customs, as we were never able to form any connections with them. They had not so much touched the things we had left in their huts on purpose for them to take away. On the right is a painting, a very recent acquisition by the museum, done by an Aboriginal artist, Vincent Namatjira, the grandson of Albert Namatjira. And when he was a teenager, he saw a replica of the Endeavour ship in Fremantle and became fascinated by Cook, and has painted this and a number of other paintings. But one of the things that Vincent Namatjira said in painting this painting of Cook was, after Cook, everything was between us all, between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. So people know about Cook, Botany Bay, but on the other side of the continent, there were also first landings and first encounters. This spear point on the left was collected by Philip Parker King at Hanover Bay in northwest Australia in 1821. And when he was there for several days, the surgeon on the boat got speared. And he thought the natives needed punishment. And he wrote, an opportunity now offered of punishing these wretches for their treacherous conduct, and of disappointing them in their present plans, for they were evidently intent upon making some mischief. And then he goes on to describe as punishment, he took all the objects out of the canoe and took the canoes and took other objects. And then he said, but What chiefly attracted our attention was a small bundle of bark tied up with more than the usual care. Upon opening it, we found it contained several spearheads, most ingeniously and curiously made of stone, and goes on to describe them. And yeah, that's one of the earliest objects in the museum from Australia. Here, the object on the left was collected by Quakers on Flinders Island in Tasmania in 1832, who were travelling to various colonies, and in particular to the Bass Strait Islands, to investigate Aboriginal people living with sealers in conditions they had rumoured were akin to slavery. And they went to the Bass Strait Islands and took evidence from some of the Aboriginal people there, collected this club, which ended up back at the Yorkshire Philosophical Society, and they sold it to the British Museum in 1926. On Flinders Island in 1845, the colonial artist John Skinner Prout went and spent a week or so and painted portraits. And there were about 35 portraits that he painted, these drawings that are in the collections of the museum. This one was labelled Sarah from Cape Portland. She was my grandmother's grandmother, and she was born in about 1806 and stolen by sealers, sold through several sealers' hands for one time for 2 seal skins, and ended up on the Bass Strait Islands and Flinders Island. It was her daughter, who was born in 1834, Fanny Cochrane Smith, that has resulted in skills of basket making and traditional Aboriginal words that were recorded in 1889 being recorded. So these objects on Flinders Island have such important strong resonance for Aboriginal people in Tasmania today, and myself. Here on the right you might see, some people might look at this and say that's a beautiful shield. It's typical of what you find in the rainforest regions of North Queensland. As an object of art, it would reach, have a very high monetary value. It was collected in 1865 by John Ewan Davidson, who in the popular literature is described as a pioneer of the sugar industry in Queensland. But to get land for the sugar, they often had to, which was common in Queensland in the 1860s, Aboriginal people had to be removed from the land, and that often happened. And he wrote extensive diaries of his time, and the native police were often involved in removing Aboriginal people for the land. And in regard to 2 comments from his diary, he said, when he was out, he said, "Some Aborigines were seen ahead and shot down. It is a strange and painful sight to see a human being running for his life and see the black police galloping after him and hear the crack of the carbines." He went on to say, "There was plenty of blood on 1 or 2 of the shields we picked up." This is a more recent painting from Central Arnhem Land in the 1830s. While some people may have seen the show Australia at the Royal Academy last year, and many examples of bark painting, as well as being important for reproduction of cultural knowledge over the generations, for many Aboriginal people, the production of art is also an important statement of their knowledge of their country, their spirits, and by continuing to paint these things, continue to express a desire for outsiders to understand it. This object from the Torres Strait is a garden hoe collected by the anthropologist Haddon in about 1899, and it's a hoe with a shell, it's a piece of wood, but by reference to the Mabo decision in 1992, it reflects the history of gardening and the important evidence of gardening in the Mabo decision, which the justices of the High Court said was of a kind unknown to English law. And also from the Torres Strait, a more recent object by an artist from Moa called Angela Torrenbeek. And this and other objects people there, and particularly Angela, make out of discarded fishing nets, which pollute the waters of northern Australia, because the huge fishing nets are removed from, or fall off ships. They kill sea animals, and people recover the fibre and make new objects for sale. So by clearing the ocean, making new objects, making an income, they continue to care for their country, and it's a country which is, in the Torres Strait, is also subject to global warming. So this very simple basket has so many stories. I've told you a glimpse of some of the objects and their histories. It's going to be, I've learned so far that this history isn't well known here. There's a lot to be learned. There's a huge amount to be researched. I'm not sure why more people aren't doing that, because it's so interesting. And I hope you'll come and see the exhibition at the British Museum next year. Thank you.
Thanks very much. As Ian generously said at the beginning, I teach urban and regional planning at UCL. I should say something disparaging about kings at this point, I guess, but I'm going to rise above it. And from the position of my high horse, I'm going to talk about cities and regions, which is the subject that I'm particularly interested in. And I approach these questions less from a cultural perspective and more from a perspective of a social scientist, I suppose. I'm interested in why cities and regions grow, why they decline. I'm interested in these things in the context of living in what is now officially an urban planet. The majority of people on the planet now live in urban areas. So this topic of the future of cities and regions is of course a global topic, or a topic of global concern, but I'm going to suggest that it should be central to Australian studies. I want to begin with a set of propositions which I'll explore in the moments ahead. I want to begin with the proposition that cities drive growth. They drive the growth of the urban economy. Cities are the engines of growth in the world economy. It's a very powerfully held view by politicians, by planners and others, and I want to say a little bit more about that in a moment. By some measures, Australia is the most urban nation in the world, although we've been talking about country and notions of country and belonging. Of course, Australia, a large portion of the Australian population lives in cities, so any thinking about Australian studies surely should take into account this notion of Australia as an urban nation. And I want to also emphasise that economic activity in Australia is in many ways concentrated not just in cities, but heavily concentrated in the core city, in the core urban cores, the CBDs of the capital cities. And I want to just demonstrate some evidence on that. And then I want to explore another proposition, which is that regional Australia, a term which as an Englishman took me a while to understand what it meant, but regional Australia is dying. As economic activity becomes more and more concentrated in Australian cities, the consequence of that is the decline of regional Australia. So I want to explore some of these propositions and perhaps complicate some of the hypotheses, as we social scientists call them, or straw arguments, as the person in the street might describe them, in my remarks. So just a moment to think about the ideas which drive these debates, which shape these debates. Draw your attention perhaps to the work of an economist like Edward Glaser from Harvard, who's written a very influential book called The Triumph of the City, which very strongly makes this view that economic activity in the world is increasingly concentrated in cities. And there are powerful reasons for this, because cities produce all kinds of economic efficiencies. The efficiencies derive from the power of agglomeration, the power of economic activities concentrating together. Primarily the power of people moving together to cooperate in the production of goods and services. The more concentration there is in place, the more productive the world economy is. And this is a very powerful argument. This is one of these books which has crossed from the world of arcane academic debate to be widely discussed beyond the world of economics and reviewed and so on in newspapers. And very widely read by the people who are concerned with the future of cities and regions in the UK, in Australia, in the United States, and many other countries around the world. Wherever you go, you will be in the footsteps of Edward Glaser, who's been selling these ideas very successfully. And there's some evidence to support this notion that economic activity is concentrated very strongly in cities. So this is one way of representing this phenomenon. It's an unusual measure, but it's a measure of economic activity which is becoming more and more widely used. And it presents data on GDP, gross domestic product, economic output, per square kilometre. And what we see is that Australia is characterised by a number of rather obvious spikes in this way of representing the data, which obviously to this audience I don't need to explain where the spikes are. But the point is that economic activity in Australia is very heavily concentrated, particularly in the capital cities, when we measure it in this way. But then if we sort of look inside the cities, we see that economic activity is strongly concentrated within the cores of those cities. And this is a set of data representing these processes, representing this measure of economic concentration just for Sydney. We could provide very similar maps for cities like Melbourne and Brisbane and so on. But we see that in the top left-hand figure, the extraordinary degree of economic concentration within the CBD of Sydney itself. Within other parts of Sydney, we see sort of concentrations of economic activity in places like the North Shore and Macquarie Park, Parramatta, an emerging hotspot within the Greater Sydney region. So this is demonstrating where wealth is produced within Sydney, heavily concentrated in the CBD. We can also in the bottom left-hand corner of the slide see the extent to which economic activity per working hour, that is the most productive parts of the economy, are concentrated again in the CBD and one or two other spots scattered around Sydney. And the figure in the bottom right-hand corner shows that 50% of all of the economic activity in the Greater Sydney region is concentrated within these shaded areas, notably from the harbour down past the airport to Botany Bay and on the North Shore and around Parramatta. So the concentration of economic activities in the cities of Australia is a very striking phenomenon. And the corollary of this is changes occurring within regional Australia. And there are two sort of dominant tropes when we talk about regional Australia. One is a story of decline. A typical example here from South Australia of market towns, of country towns, which have traditionally played a big role in the agricultural economy in rural Australia and regional Australia, which are essentially in decline. And the most sort of dominant media discourse around this is about the loss of youth from these towns as economic opportunities shrink and simultaneously economic opportunities expand in the cities. The other sort of main story that you would associate with regional Australia is the story of the mining boom. And in that first map of spikes I showed, there were one or two spikes outside the capital cities, and they are very much associated with places which are benefiting in some ways from the mining boom. And that includes the production of new towns, particularly in places like inland Queensland or parts of Western Australia, where we see, even someone pointed out to me the cashed up bogan with his boat outside his house. An interesting sort of phenomenon in these regional areas where huge wages can be earned in sectors like mining. Now, one argument that arises as a result of this discussion of these phenomena is represented by work which has come out of the Grattan Institute in Melbourne, which is a think tank which seeks to inform debates about social and economic change in Australia, and has paid very close attention to this question of the relative position of cities and regions in Australia. And this is a quote from a report which the Institute produced in 2011, a report which is very much influenced by the kind of ideas drawn from Glaser that I mentioned earlier on, in which they're suggesting that efforts to protect or even revive regional Australia are bound to fail because the powerful forces of agglomeration which are concentrating in economic activities in cities are irresistible. And too much money has been wasted in trying to keep alive regional economies which are no longer productive. Another way of looking at this is that Australia has traditionally had this compact between the city and the country, which Judith Brett, in an interesting essay, a quarterly essay a little while back, described as an element of the Australian settlement, which is now broken down. So there's a widening gap, politically, culturally, and economically, between regional Australia and the cities. But is this a fair representation of the real state of the economic geography of Australia? Is economic activity bound to concentrate in cities? Is economic activity bound to shrink in remoter regions? Well, evidence from around the world, gathered neatly in a recent study by the OECD, is cast doubt on that, despite those powerful graphs that I showed at the beginning. Less developed regions, they argue, can and do make a vital contribution to the national growth of many economies. And in OECD countries, it was predominantly rural regions which on average enjoyed faster growth in the period before the economic, what Australians call the global financial crisis. And this is a good thing. It brings wide benefits. It relieves congestion in the big cities. But there are lots of barriers to the growth of regional communities, although critical to their growth is the presence of human capital. So, just to emphasise this, sorry to introduce a graph after all these beautiful pictures of Indigenous art and children's drawings and so on. But yes, it's certainly the case that in the OECD countries, a very significant proportion of growth is concentrated in a small number of regions. A very significant proportion of growth is spread across a much wider range of regions. So I'm interested in this group of regions which are not necessarily contributing the most growth, but nevertheless still remain significant. So when we talk about regional Australia, we're talking about these regions in the green shaded regions. The cities are in red here. And if we think about these green shaded regions, what we discover is that actually these regions in Australia provide 67% of Australia's national export income, partly reflecting the mining boom activities as well. And 5 million people live in the regional cities which have populations over 50,000, which is more than the population of Sydney. So the picture of economic activity and people concentrated just in these handful of places is a bit more complicated than we might think. Home to 32% of Australia's population. So there's quite a lot of economic activity and people still, despite this process of urbanisation, occurring in regional Australia. So the story of regional decline and population loss is not quite borne out by the statistics. It's certainly true that young people leave regional Australia and generally head for the cities. But in later life, many young people who've subsequently had families then return to regional Australia. And then later in life, super boomers, so-called super boomers, are showing signs of moving to the regions. So this 30-odd% population in regional Australia remains relatively stable over time, just as a result of these movements. Now the nature of that population is changing. We can see the ageing of the population of regional Australia as a problem, but also we can see it as a potential strength in the sense that these are groups which have, generally speaking, significant amounts of money to spend locally. Similarly, if we think of regional Australia as just about agriculture and mining, we're getting the picture wrong. It's certainly true that in places mining and agriculture remain very important, but in many parts of regional Australia, as this figure demonstrates, which shows the contribution of the major sectors to local economic growth, we find that there's quite a wide diversity of economic activity taking place in regional Australia. It's not just about mining and agriculture. There's a lot going on, tourism and other key sectors. I'll just skip that one and we'll go to the conclusions because I'm running out of time. So, what have I tried to say here? Well, I tried to make a small and a modest contribution from an Englishman to a debate about the future of Australian studies. Well, I say an Englishman, I'm from Newcastle upon Tyne. I don't know if that really makes me an Englishman or not. So, I've emphasised that cities matter. There's no question that they do, and that very large portions of the population and economic activity are concentrated there. But this level of concentration, particularly in CBDs, may itself be producing all kinds of problems. Congestion, pressures on land, labour and housing markets, and so on. But cities will continue to matter. But the story of regional Australia is not one of general decline. It's a much more complicated story than that. Yet it's still, in many ways, the dominant narrative in Australian in Australian public discourse. And the data I've drawn on to demonstrate this point is drawn from the Regional Australia Institute, an institute which I work with based in Canberra, established by endowment from the Australian government, which is seeking to get a better understanding of what's actually happening in regional Australia and as a result, I think, complicating the story about it. So in regional Australia, population is stable overall, but reflecting new demographics, movement of more elderly people with often with high disposable income into these areas for lifestyle reasons. And I've also demonstrated that the economy of regional Australia is more diverse than the stereotype suggests. So regions also matter as well as cities. Thank you.
Okay, we can, so thank you for three excellent and very provocative papers, really approaching this from very different angles, but I thought they spoke to each other actually quite well. I want to open up the floor almost immediately to questions. Who wants to go first? Go, Frank. You might, but quite be useful to just say who you are when you speak.
Oh, sorry, yeah, Frank Bongiorno, Australian National University. John, I wanted to ask you a few things. I mean, it seems to me the concept of region is a bit problematic here because there's a story, isn't there, about inland Australia, and there's a story about what's happening on the coast, and particularly the eastern coast, where there are very sizable towns. And I would have thought, you know, substantial population growth in some areas. And I'm just wondering, firstly, about that term region and whether there is a kind of a working definition at the institute that you're partnering is using. I mean, I remember a few years ago I was working on a New South Wales state government committee, and in our operation we were increasingly treating Western Sydney as a region in its own right. We would talk about it as a region of 1 million people, and we weren't the only part of the bureaucracy doing that. And so I'm wondering, I guess, a bit about the ways in which you're using that term region, and whether it might be more helpful to distinguish, I guess, between the coastal strip, I guess, as it's sometimes called, and the inland town.
Yes, I mean, I guess I could have. Do you want to answer this question?
Yes.
I guess I could have, and perhaps maybe should have, showed a typology of regions which we have been working on, yeah. I suppose I was making a much more general point that there's a great deal of diversity in regional Australia. Some places are declining in regional Australia, there's no question about that, but other places are growing strongly. Some of those are the coastal regions, which are developing around tourism and so on. And I guess I've used this, there's very few occasions in the UK context when I'm ever talking about Australia, that I'd actually talk about regional Australia, and everybody knows what I'm talking about. Because this notion that there's a metropolitan Australia and a regional Australia is something which, coming from a European context, is a very difficult thing initially to get your head around, because the notion that you have regional areas and city areas as separate is something that doesn't make sense in a European context. So let's say Catalonia is a region. I know it's a nation, but for argument's sake, let's say Catalonia is a region. It's a region which contains a very important city in the form of Barcelona. Whereas in the Australian context, you would talk about regions as something outside of cities. And that's a very difficult distinction for Europeans to understand. And I agree that Sydney itself probably contains several urban regions with different economic dynamics. I mean, Parramatta is a place that I've looked at closely in relation to these issues. Fascinating place, which is growing very rapidly, and has the potential to be an alternative CBD to the current CBD. I don't know whether that's a long way off, but there's some interesting dynamics going on there, which are partly the result of overheating in central Sydney. So yes, I was making a rather simpler point than the one you're asking me to make, which is that there's a great deal of diversity in regional Australia, and some of it's about growth. Now, partly that's in response to the view that you will get from a certain branch of economics, which has been very influential in Australia through the work of organisations like the Grattan Institute, which essentially sees regional Australia as problematic, as a place which gets too much financial support, too many efforts to help it grow, when in fact there's probably more potential there for growth than we give it credit for.
Yeah, my name is Stuart Ward from the University of Copenhagen, and a question for Gay. It could be that me that's misunderstood, but do I understand that the museum still continues to acquire objects from Australia?
Definitely.
Okay, well how is that negotiated or navigated in the continuing turbulent waters of repatriation and all the litigation that's going on and so forth? How does that sort of pan out in an area of science that continues to source its raw material from different parts of the world?
Well, in our contemporary collecting, we usually buy from respected art centres in Australia. It supports contemporary Indigenous artists. We rarely, if ever, buy from second-hand dealers or auctions. We're interested in documenting Indigenous culture as a living, ongoing tradition. So in what we buy objects that are being made and used by Aboriginal people now, who are very happy to have their objects come to the British Museum and exhibited next year.
So is it possible, looking through your collection over the last 200 odd years, to map out roughly when there was a tipping point between just sort of taking stuff and exhibiting it and moving towards a process of negotiation and a more self-conscious or self-aware policy for picking bits and pieces up?
Yeah, it's very interesting, the history of the museum's collections from Australia and all the various reasons why people collected it. And obviously, if you go back to some of the instructions that the naval people were given, it was to look for natural and artificial curiosities. It was the end of the age of enlightenment. People wanted to know things. And then often, even up until the mid-19th century, there were all sorts of people sending things back. From Swan River, 1838, a settler. A lot of the people in Australia had relatives back here in England. They would send things back. Things were very rarely collected for the museum. They were brought back here by other people in the 1850s and 60s. Colonial governments in Australia were sending things back for the Great Exhibition here in 1851 from Tasmania to the Paris exhibition in 1867. At the turn of the century, the governments of Victoria were sending things here. People were still coming back and forth in the early 20th century, and some people would say, oh, I spent time in Australia. I think these objects are important. I'd like to give a memory of my father in the British Museum. But I think, like a lot of museums, both in Australia, for many museums here and in Australia, people were, in the 20th century, collecting things because they were thought to be objects from a dying race. And it wasn't until the 1960s and 1970s that museums here and in Australia realised that this race wasn't going to go away, important things were being made, and there are some parallels with an Australian and British museums from the 1960s and 70s that objects began to be collected more actively, and here with support of certain people from the 1980s onwards.
Thanks, Stuart. My name's Simon Slight. I'm lecturer in Australian history here at King's College London. Really observations for Anne. Thanks very much for your paper, which I found really wonderful, actually. The first is sort of an attempt to answer your question about why these photos hold such fascination for the public and indeed for scholars. And you showing them brought to mind a piece I read by the theorist Victor Bergin, who says photographs are situated in an unending process of becoming. And it also brought to mind work by Jane Lydon and others on photographs as a two-way visual exchange. She talks about what she terms looking relations. And I think they offer an immediacy, and I'm sure you know this, so it's really an observation. They offer an immediacy that's so compelling that I think that in part perhaps explains why they're so sort of prized as objects reflecting this disaster. And then trying to link that to the paintings of the bushfires. They brought to mind an exhibition I saw in Prague of Jewish children's paintings of the Holocaust. And I think what may be going on here is that children often, in the aftermath of disasters, are sort of pioneers of the repopulation of space. So if we look to the period after the Second World War, for example, when many cities were bombed, children's playgrounds and children's sort of free play becomes symbolic of the recreation of cities. So yeah, I found it wonderful, and really there's no question, it's just that was my thinking on what you had to say.
Okay, thank you for that, because I was hoping people would actually consider those questions. I did throw them out, not rhetorically, but to see what you did have to say about it. And I guess from my point of view, I was thinking about the children's paintings, because I think it is, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think it's fairly unusual to collect them in that way and then to protect them and store them and exhibit them for future generations. And so I thought there were two things going on there. And that one was about these children being our future. And when we're talking about environmental catastrophe, this, in a sense, they are the ones on the ground. They are the ones who are most deeply, in a sense, affected into the future. And so I thought they were significant from that point of view. But also something to do with the way children see the world. So what was interesting to me was that some of the children clearly had, in part, put down what they'd heard other people talking about. But also a lot of it was something that was immediately felt and very carefully observed. So the picture that I actually presented at the symposium we held, Tom Griffiths was talking about Chinwag fires, and he said that the image by Sarah was an absolute perfect rendition of exactly what that kind of fire looks like. It could have been scientific, it could have been a photograph. I thought that was fascinating because to some degree, if you have a child at an early enough age, you aren't getting quite so much, what would you call it, I don't know, cultural, visual kind of learning going into it, but it's much more clearly seen. So I thought that was really interesting as well. But the Holocaust is a really interesting example of that art. Yeah, thank you.
I'd like to, yes, yeah. It's right. Hang on. We're all in this together.
Thanks. Nathaniel O'Reilly from Texas Christian University. I had kind of a follow-up to Stuart's question for Gay. I visited the British Museum 2 years ago to look at the Indigenous collection from Australia, and it was my first visit in 15 years, and it was my impression that the collection was a fraction of what it used to be, and I'm wondering if my memory was just wrong. And I thought at the time, I said to my daughter, well, maybe.
Are there other ways of reading some of these images from children that actually indicate the destruction of community by these disasters? And whether it's important that that message is also brought out in order to actually, underline the impact of these kinds of environmental disasters on human communities.
Yeah, I think very definitely. I think they're doing both things. I think that was the case, particularly with the photographs in Japan as well. The photographs themselves had been destroyed as the communities were destroyed, as connection between people was destroyed. That's very definitely the case, but I think that you've got the two things happening together. So you've got one that's displaying destruction, but you've also got that kind of ongoing sense of resilience, of kind of, in a sense, refusal to give into it, that kind of sense of... I thought, okay, so the other thing I thought in relation to that was interesting was that the exhibition that was mounted in Australia was very much about pulling together. We're supporting one another. Japan is getting over this, et cetera, et cetera. This was the exhibition that was designed by the Japanese government to give the message to the world that we could survive this, we could cope, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas the one that kind of came, the grassroots one that came out of the people there involved, intimately involved, was more akin to, this is awful, this is terrifying, this is destructive, but it also wasn't without hope. And I think the fact that the photographs were returned in the numbers they were was amazing, but that people felt that that return was enormously important, and the connections that were rebuilt were enormously important. So I definitely take your point, it definitely does that. But I think the emphasis was also about resilience, kind of refusing to allow it to kind of break that community, almost to the point, where people are insisting on going back to those towns, which it's incredibly dangerous to their health. They are, because the community mattered so much. Point taken, definitely.
Okay, so I've got Sheridan and then David and then Helen.
Sheridan Humphreys. I'm a PhD student here in the Menzies Centre. It's just a question about the regional regeneration, or comment really, because a few years ago I was researching, looking at this just for something I was writing, but I was reading Australian newspapers for farmers and for regional communities, and there seemed to be two obsessions in the articles and in the advertising, and one was succession planning for farmers and what would happen to the family farm and that kind of thing. And the other one was the regeneration issue, and there was a lot of articles particularly about how America had dealt with this issue of the exodus of people from smaller towns. And I just wondered if that's something that has a similarity to Australia, or are we behind America, or is there, perhaps you could, I welcome your observations on that.
Yeah, I think it's always very difficult to say whether Australia is behind America, the US in this context. There's a lot of comparisons between Australia and Canada in relation to these sorts of issues. There's always the problem of comparing places which on the face of it have somewhat similar problems, but on closer investigation, how the context within which those problems exist is quite different. The structures of governance, the availability of resources. So in the United States, there's quite a degree of variation, I think, between different parts of the country as to how they've dealt with these problems. And that reflects the fact that it's a federal structure where there's a great deal of variation in the way in which state governments have responded to these problems, obviously on a much larger scale than is the case in the United States. I think there's a great deal of interest, certainly, for instance, on the part of the Regional Australia Institute, in learning lessons from abroad, not just from the United States and Canada, but from even parts of Europe, parts, say, the Arctic regions of Europe, which are losing population. Is it possible to create viable economies in those places? Actually, it is. There are quite clearly strong, viable knowledge economies in remote parts of Europe. What are the factors which bring that about? Probably it's to do with investments in people and technology, but it's also judicious forms of policy intervention by smart governments make a big difference. There's no question about that. But those are the most difficult things to transfer: judicious investments and smart government. I mean, it sounds like a fine solution, but they're the most difficult things to achieve. But nevertheless, I think that there are lessons which can be learned internationally which are relevant to Australia. And I think one of the issues is how to transfer those lessons in a usable way, not in a fast way where you say, well, this policy worked in country X, now let's apply it in country Y. That's almost a guarantee of failure. But to understand the context within which certain kinds of policy work under certain circumstances, and then consider whether the circumstances exist within your jurisdiction for those policies to work. I think it's one of the great challenges of studying cities and regions, to find these ways of learning the right lessons and applying them appropriately.
David Callaghan from the University of Aveiro in Portugal, a location which will have some bearing on my question to Anne. When you finished your talk, you ended with this sort of ringing peroration about funding, and in the context of your talking about Australian studies as a tool for connection sort of thing, I thought you were going to talk about funding for your position that you had in Japan, in other places or that sort of thing. Obviously, funding for climate change is much more important than this sort of funding, but it struck me that this was two rich countries being connected here. And from the perspective of where I live, where we haven't bought a book for the university library for 7 years, and there are instructions to go easy on the toilet paper and stuff like that. There's been no funding for conferences for 8 years and so forth and so on. I'm wondering how Australian studies or anything can be a tool for connection given material constraints that most places operate under, and obviously in a world context Portugal is a relatively wealthy country, let alone all the other places. So I know this is a meta question, really, on the top of what you were really talking about. But in the context of the future of Australian studies, it made me, aroused that doubt. How can this?
I don't answer that. And you're certainly correct that the Denmark, Tokyo, well-funded, very well-funded institutions, and it definitely makes it easier. And certainly the case is true in Stuart's League. Well, relatively speaking, shall we say, yes. Although very recently there's been quite we'll go into that. But the other thing it reminded me of as well was Canadian studies, similarly, where the Canadian government was always very generous and has kind of started to retract its funding. So we had a kind of conference which tried to get scholars together to talk about what the future of Canadian studies internationally was, and there were similar questions about a lack of funding. So I suppose, I guess the actual centres themselves I can see struggle, but I suppose in one sense perhaps the fact that we have the internet and we have those kinds of connections that can still be made. We can read one another's work in a sense as soon as it's written, if it's on the internet. I guess those kinds of things are helpful, but I always think that actually getting together face to face is enormously important. But I feel like I come from the lucky generation that's been able to travel around the world and make those connections personally. Because I guess one of the points I was making, and I certainly take your point, is that actually being outside Australia and living in a different country, I think it's something Gay said, gives you a different perspective on your own country. So it's not just about promoting Australian studies in the world, it's actually about learning from that world and taking it back as well. So I don't know how to answer your question because it is a problem issue.
Okay, we have a few lineups now. That's provoked. So it's that's a good start. Helen at the back,
I have a
please.
different question. If anybody wants to take
To respond to that, Riz.
because it's probably better for that to go first. Can I do this?
So maybe. So there's two. Yeah.
Thank you. Is this on?
Yep.
Vera Alexander, also University of Copenhagen. It struck me, actually, one of the things that connected all three brilliant talks was this focus on relationality and rephrasing perhaps not so much a new ground down under, which is a bit of an oxymoron in a way because it presents innovation, but at the same time it reuses that old word. So it's a bit of a critical term for us to perhaps dissect. But what the papers did was model a sense of relationality, of phrasing a way of relating to Australia across the Gulf, which, at least in two cases, very strongly involved the emotions in those quotations from the museum visitors, which I think we can all relate to from our student evaluations, stuff like that. And obviously the emotional potential that those absolutely amazing paintings, watercolors of fire, actually present. And so finding a way of phrasing and capturing and using that emotional power, that affective power, that perhaps can cross the Gulf more effectively than questions of do we know enough about Australia that, you know, drive people visiting institutions such as a museum. You should leave it wiser, you should acquire knowledge, you need to know about the sheep and things like that. What I'm trying to say is there a way of revising that emotional potential and relational potential and think beyond just connection and involve relationships, the human and affective dimension of that.
Sue Byrne from the Australian Studies Centre at the University of Barcelona. I'd like to pick up on what David said, and I hope this will come in tomorrow. At my university, we are hiring people for €200 to €400 a month. I need only say that. But what I hope will emerge tomorrow, with regards to the relationality in all your talks, which I've enjoyed immensely, is something that happened in Tokyo this summer, which was a panel on globalizing Australian studies. And what really emerged from that panel were strategic positions that were taken up by people from China, from Europe, from Japan, because I think this is what we need here. And it leads me to wonder whether the kind of work that Gay is doing at the British Museum has ever been done anywhere else in Europe. And I say that because the Ethnological Museum in Barcelona has an amazing collection of Aboriginal artefacts, but the question is, how did they get there? We know how some of them got there, but others not, and that kind of work also needs to be done.
I think that Nick Thomas and there is some work going on in Pacific Presences about those kinds of.
But that doesn't include Australia.
That doesn't include Australia. Okay. Can take it's to Helen.
Oh, I don't need one.
Oh, he's a good Aussie gal.
It's a small question and takes us back to the minutiae in a way, but I was very fascinated with the photograph of the photograph album with that dust from the debris of the disaster in Japan infiltrating that very intimate space of the photo album. And I wondered if the exhibition that you have talked about is leaving
Okay, thank you. That's a great question. The actual album itself that you saw was in the exhibition for a start, so there was that sense of that. And also you could look through a whole lot of images where, okay, so you could actually touch it as such, but you could actually see what the photographs looked like as they were being recovered or as they were being repaired as well as they could. So there was some evidence of that, but perhaps not as much as you're suggesting might have been possible, which is very interesting. I was going to say in
I guess
relation.
I'd just like to think
It's
about
really
that
interesting, yeah.
complication to thinking,
Yeah.
In Australia, sorry, my dates are going to be all wrong, but when some of the people who are making a claim for compensation after the bombings at Maralinga came in a representation to Britain, I can't put dates on that, sorry, I'm a hopeless historian, it came with some soil to show the committee that they were talking about and said, you know, this is soil from our land. Here's, you know, something that we can show you that should not have been contaminated in the way it is. And I think those material objects, as Gay's talk so powerfully demonstrates, something that we might want to explore in our classrooms, in our conferences and so forth as connecting.
I think that's one of the things that does actually speak to what I want to say about this kind of photographic exhibition that was so different to the usual disaster photographs. But what you were actually seeing was the damaged photographs. And some of them were so that's the actual material damage. So aside from seeing kind of the human beings as though they had been, as if it were the human beings affected by the earthquake, the tsunami, etc., what you were actually seeing was that material damage, and some of them were so obscure you could barely see them. And the interesting thing in terms of what you're saying is you practically had to put your nose against them to make anything out of quite a lot of them. So it's a good point, it's definitely true. It was part of what you did in the exhibition. So that you, seriously, you were like this trying to figure out what on earth was in the photograph because it was that damaged. So that does work, yeah.
I have one last question from Bart. Please take
Bart Zielinski, I'm a PhD student at the Menzies Centre for Australian Studies. A question for John. You were talking about political structures in different places, and I was wondering whether you could put Australia in a comparative context, maybe, where well, you were talking about states and how countries are structured, whether you think that how is Australia compared to other places with its structure set up to face the challenges of urbanization or of the balance between the regions and the urban? I mean, is it better to have stronger regions, weaker regions, comparing it with, I don't know, maybe Switzerland or other places to take an extreme where something is extremely regionalized?
Very, very good question. I mean, I think Australia is quite distinctive, and there's a significant degree of variation within Australia in the way in which places are governed, obviously. I mean, there'll be people in this room who can, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but if you, in international terms, Australia looks like quite a devolved political structure in the sense that it has strong states, but below the states, local government in Australia looks comparatively weak. A significant variation, say, between New South Wales and Victoria, where you have much larger local authorities, and therefore they have a bit more room to act. But they're very much, local government is very much the creature of the state governments. They have very little constitutional protection in the way that local government would have in other countries. In New South Wales, and particularly within Sydney itself, you have some, by international standards, very small local authorities. The local authority of the CBD contains a population of less than 100,000, I think I'm correct in saying, and that makes it very small. It produces an incredible amount of Australia's wealth, according to the measures I was showing earlier on, but it's a very tightly bounded structure, and that produces all kinds of unintended consequences in terms of how you govern the whole metropolitan region. So in terms of the provision of public realm and things like this, the CBD looks really good, but in other parts of the Greater Sydney region where the rate base is much lower because there aren't mechanisms for transferring resources generated through the tax system in Sydney itself to other local authority areas, then you find that the public realm is less well developed. And the other key factor which is striking in an international context is the lack of a system for governing the metropolitan region, say, in somewhere like Sydney or Melbourne. You have the state concerned with Sydney and the rest of New South Wales, let's say, in the case of New South Wales. And you have local governments, often quite small, not always, but often quite small, and no mechanism for planning the development of the metropolitan area. And I think that's a very distinctive feature of Australian cities. And outside of the cities, local government comparatively weak, and most of the power and resources in the hands of states, which are quite remote often from the problems that rural and regional areas face.
I'd like to just briefly wrap up by knitting some of our discussion back into something that was happening last night when Philip Mead was speaking at the mining literature panel, part of the English departments here. And one of the things Philip raised there that I found very interesting, it was sort of part but not necessarily central to his talk, came out of his tracing the relative careers of Alexis Wright and Marcia Langton, looking at the way that Marcia Langton had moved from being a regionalist activist, if you like, into the cultural industry. And by contrast, one could argue Marcia Langton had moved out of the cultural industry and into a regionalist kind of activism, wherein she was supporting mining for the kinds of working opportunities that it was offering regional Aboriginal communities. And it struck me, looking at your maps, John, that I also wanted to map or think about the vitality of that small growth in the majority. The majority area has small growth, but it actually altogether is quite a significant growth. Coupled with myself as probably a self-confessed urban elitist who finds regional Australia makes me nervous. Or I feel nervous when I'm in regional Australia. And this is it's easy to laugh at, but I guess I'm trying to kind of suggest that the kinds of statistics that you were showing us, I think, really reminds us to really pay attention to this other Australia, which we can too easily associate not only with lack of growth, but also with very conservative political values, which seem to grate against those concerns or preoccupations of the kinds of urban elites that are producing Australian studies, if you like. So I guess that's something that I will take with me from both those two events as we move into tomorrow's symposium, which begins, I think, at the very bright hour of 8:30 a.m. for registration and 9 a.m. for the welcome. But I think we've seen some very interesting distinctions to messed up some distinctions which I think are useful for us to think through. Contrast between rich wealth and poverty within Australia and across countries that do Australian studies. Thinking about the relationship between statistics and aesthetics as they impact on the way we do Australian studies. Thinking about the impact of ideas and emotions, if you like, as we think transnationally. We think ourselves transnationally, if that's what we want to do into the future. We have some lovely transnational wine waiting for us downstairs. If you take the lifts directly down to the second floor, you'll find a reception in chapters where you can mingle with people from other aspects of the Underground Festival. So finally, will you join me in thanking our marvellous speakers, Anne Collette,